Hezbollah has confirmed the death of its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, in an Israeli airstrike in Beirut. This is the moment Israel's military struck Hezbollah's underground headquarters in the city late Friday. The attack flattened several apartment blocks in the densely populated area. Rescuers desperately searched for survivors, but Israeli officials reportedly estimated that 300 people may have been killed. Hezbollah later confirmed the death of the man who headed the Iran-backed militia group for some 3 decades and vowed to continue fighting Israel. Let's get more from journalist Karim El-Gawhary. He joins us from Beirut. Karim, Hezbollah has confirmed the death of its leader, Hassan Nasrallah. What more can you tell us?
Well, it was at noontime after a long silence that Hezbollah finally confirmed in a written statement that its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, is dead. In the same statement, they were saying his spirit and his ideas will remain with us, and they were demanding from its fighters to continue in his promise to their resistance until victory. So until now, there is no more statement from Hezbollah. There is basically also not a date set for his funeral, but altogether quite tense situation on the streets in Beirut.
How are Lebanese responding to Nasrallah's killing? Understanding, of course, there must be a diversity of views out there.
Well, I mean, I was on the street when his death was announced by Hezbollah, and his supporters, I mean, I saw them very emotional. They were starting to cry. Some of them were sitting down on the street. Really scenes of devastation among their leaders. When you look at the political scene, of course, no more statements from Hezbollah, but the Hezbollah allies, for example, some of the Christian allies of Hezbollah is talking about the great loss of his death poses, and asking people in Lebanon to stand by in this difficult hour. The caretaker prime minister himself just made a rather vague statement saying danger is threatening us. But of course you have also those who are secretly satisfied, who were thinking that Hezbollah has too much power, Hezbollah is too strong as a state in the state, and they are not saying this publicly. They're like really careful what they are saying now. And just like an hour and a half ago, there was a group of Hezbollah supporters here passing by with their motorcycles, shooting into the air, kind of saying like, you know, we are here, be careful, don't even think about it in the direction of those who might be happy with the death of Hassan Nasrallah.
Got it. And from where you're standing in Beirut, what do you think we might expect from Iran next?
Well, Iran, of course, is the big sponsor of Hezbollah. The Iranian president said that this whole thing will just strengthen the resistance. So defiant sounds from Tehran, also from the Ali Khamenei, the great leader himself, who was saying that this killing of the Hezbollah leader would be avenged, and his past in fighting Israel would be continued by other militants. Nasrallah, he said, was not an individual. His past and his school of thought, and this will all continue. So defiant sounds from Iran. No indication if there will be any military answer from there, what is of course still possible.
Journalist Karim El-Gawhary in Beirut, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
I'm joined now from Tel Aviv by Major Doron Spielman, a spokesman for the Israeli military. Welcome, Major Spielman.
Thank you, Michael.
With last night's strike in Beirut, sir, Israel managed to eliminate one of its most wanted enemies. Who else was killed in the strike?
You have Mohammed al-Kawki, who was the head of the southern command of Hezbollah. Essentially, the compound that they were in was the nerve center of Hezbollah. This was the very place that they were planning attacks against Israel, where they were working on imminent attacks in the coming days, including a ground assault into Israel that was prevented a week before, the constant rockets and missiles. This essentially was the terror headquarters that not only has directed attacks that have resulted in 60,000 Israelis leaving their homes and Israel living under a barrage of 9,000 missiles, but this is the same place in which Americans were attacked in the Marine barracks, in which 240 Americans died, numerous British and European nationals. So if we think of Hitler and the lair that Hitler was in, this was the lair of Nasrallah, and the parallels, I think, are quite accurate.
Major, the strike involved dropping massive bombs on a civilian area. What is your estimate of the collateral damage caused by the strikes?
Well, I can tell you that every strike that Israel's taken in this war has been carefully evaluated, trying to minimize civilian casualties. There was a strike that took place 2 hours after this, as an example, in which we took out major warehouses that were about to fire rockets towards Israeli special chemical factories, and we were able to notify the civilian people in advance. However, unfortunately, while I don't have exact numbers to give you at this time, what I can tell you is that since Hezbollah, similar to Hamas, who uses civilians to cover up their tunnels, Hezbollah uses civilians to cover up their terror activities. Nasrallah wasn't at home. He was in a terror headquarters, which was underneath civilian buildings, and therefore he is in contravention of international law. And sadly, he makes it a legitimate military target, which Israel had no choice but to strike in order to save the people of Israel.
Israel has no choice.
What I can tell you is Nasrallah, I can tell you that Nasrallah, well, I think that any nation in the world, if I ask you a question, if Germany was being bombed and the people in Berlin were under attack and 9,000 rockets had rained down on top of them, and you knew where the person was that was doing this, would you wait a year, Michael, before you struck him?
I can surely say to you that I'm glad I'm not in position to have to make that call. But I do have to ask the questions. Some 300 people, as you surely know, died. Those are your government's own estimates. Is that a proportionate military response to the threat from Hezbollah against Israel?
I think every one of these people that has died is awful. The civilians that have died in Lebanon and in Gaza, and these are real people with real families, real mothers and fathers and children, and I get it. Every Israeli gets it, which is why on October 6th or 7th, before Hezbollah attack, no one in Israel even thought, if you would tell me a year later we would be at war with Lebanon, it was completely out of our minds. We were living within our own borders. We haven't been in Lebanon in 20 years, 24 years. And unfortunately, Hezbollah wreaks such havoc on us that it's very difficult to define proportionality. But these are the commanders of a terror regime that have struck such terror across Israel and the world that, according to our estimates and according to international law, we acted according to international law, and all these civilian casualties, and they are tragic, are on the heads of Hezbollah.
One of Israel's declared war aims is to allow residents of northern Israel displaced by Hezbollah rocket attacks to return home. How close are you to achieving that objective?
I think it's very much in the court of Iran and in Hezbollah's court. You know, as I mentioned, if Hezbollah decided at any point in time to stop shooting rockets at Israel and withdraw beyond the Litani River, which is the international law, which was the United Nations resolution they agreed to, then it would stop right away and our people could go back home. The problem is, and you can imagine, Israeli men, women, and children. I was up north yesterday walking through Kiryat Shmona, which is a ghost town. Only 3,000 people who couldn't leave are still there out of 24,000. And rockets fell almost on top of me, and no one would raise their children in that type of situation. So I think Israel will do everything it has to do to target those munitions, target those leaders. However, it's in their court, and we ask them, we're not looking for a wider conflict or an escalation. Please adhere to international law. Please stop targeting the Israeli people, and this will end within a minute.
You say that you're not looking for an escalation, but again, this is a dynamic that many observers around the world are pained to continue to watch, the back and forth. we have very little time now, but I do want to ask you, what kind of response are you expecting from Hezbollah to the assassination of its leader?
I'm not really sure. I mean, that's something that needs to be addressed to Hezbollah. What I can tell you, Michael, is that we are ready for anything that they send in our direction. We are looking and targeting all those rockets and, missiles, which we've seen. And the world is watching and has seen that you have a living room with a missile in it, and you see a Hezbollah operative pull back a blind and shoot it at central Israel. And so we're ready. We're looking for those launchers to take them out. But as I mentioned, this escalation is due to Hezbollah. While we are ready to respond and will protect our people with whatever means necessary, we are calling on the international community to see this truly is a battle of good against evil. The evil is Hezbollah. The international community needs to stand on its hind feet and tell them, adhere to international law, leave Israel alone, allow the residents who are innocent to go back, and then we can all move about our lives and build a positive future.
That is Major Doron Spielman of the Israel Defense Forces. Many, many thanks for your time, sir.
Thank you, Michael.
For more, let's now speak to DW correspondent Tania Krämer in Jerusalem. Tania, we just heard from the IDF spokesman. What else are you hearing from Israel regarding Nasrallah's death and any possible retaliation by Hezbollah?
Well, these are both the main topics here that are being discussed in the media, and it's the end of the weekend now. There are more and more political reactions also coming in. Of course, on the one hand, you have the operation itself now, then more details now emerging, and how it was possible that Israel basically infiltrated or had the intelligence to get to Hassan Nasrallah himself. I mean, we've seen over the past weeks Israel targeting senior commanders in a succession of steps against Hezbollah. And basically, there's a discussion here how the intelligence was being done, how the strike was carried out. And Nasrallah was an arch enemy of Israel, for over 30 years. He was leading the organization. And we heard also from Defense Minister Gallant saying that he was responsible for the killing of thousands of Israelis and foreign nationals. Of course, there's also what's not so much talked about maybe is the human toll that this massive strike on this underground facility that when it happened, we don't know yet how many people were killed from those who are living in this densely populated area there in Dahir when the airstrike happened on Friday night. Now, the other thing here is, of course, what comes next, and there are different scenarios being discussed. We've seen already over the course of the day over 90 rockets being fired towards the north. There was just about 2 hours ago a surface-to-surface missile launched by the Houthis in Yemen. So it's not yet this massive barrage that many military analysts would expect as retaliation. So we have to wait and see what's happening there. But also as we speak, Israel continues its airstrikes on Lebanon, southern Lebanon, but also in Beirut. And they just said in a statement they had killed another senior commander in southern Beirut. So there are different scenarios here, what could happen next. And of course, it's a watershed moment, so to speak, in a very volatile situation.
It must be very hard to gauge what happens next, but how likely is it that we'll now see an Israeli ground invasion on Lebanon?
Well, there's a lot of speculation about that, and it's not clear whether a decision has been taken yet. Certainly, we've seen preparations here in the past couple of weeks and days. More reservist units have been called up, also a build-up around in the northern border area. Basically, it may also depend what Hezbollah or, as to say, Iran will do next. There is substantive support at the moment for, going full force against Hezbollah through airstrikes. It might change a bit if there would be a ground invasion, because this is, of course, much riskier for soldiers going in there. But there's also a lot of pressure, and the people I talked to in the north, at least some of them said, this needs to be finished once and for all, this threat from Hezbollah. So we have to wait and see what's happening there.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin expressed full support for Israel's right to defend itself in a call on Friday. But what can Israel expect specifically from Washington right now?
Well, I think it's a rather sensitive moment in the relationship between the two countries now, especially when we've seen, just a couple of days ago, US President Joe Biden was coming up with this temporary ceasefire plan by the administration. And then basically the dismissal by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu very publicly. This is now what we are seeing is quite the opposite of calling for a ceasefire. So we have to wait and see. We just heard Joe Biden speaking, bringing out a statement. And we have to see, how the US will basically support Israel here and also its own troops here in the region that might come under threat.
DW correspondent Tania Krämer in Jerusalem, thank you. Hassan Nasrallah's death is a huge setback to Hezbollah and raises questions about its future. The repercussions are still sinking in for the people of Israel and Lebanon.
Beirut's Al Amin Mosque has become a focal point of grieving for Hezbollah supporters. Nasrallah's death marks a dramatic escalation in Israel's conflict with Hezbollah and has sent a shockwave throughout Lebanon.
Hassan Nasrallah is a father and a brother to us. He means everything to us. He's like a son and a brother to me.
Soon after Hezbollah confirmed Nasrallah's death, gunshots rang out in parts of Beirut in another sign of mourning. But in Israel, a completely different reaction. This mobile phone footage shows beachgoers in the Israeli Red Sea city of Eilat cheering after the announcement that Nasrallah was dead. On the streets of Israel, a mixture of relief and trepidation of what may happen next.
I do not think that the assassination will end the war, but it will get us closer to a recognition in the Arab world that we're here to stay and don't screw with us.
It means more danger, but I think maybe it will end this for good. And because we're suffering for years and years. And I think maybe if it will be war, this will end.
On Saturday, Israel carried out more airstrikes on Beirut and here in southern Lebanon at what it says are Hezbollah targets. A sure sign that Israel's conflict with Hezbollah is set to continue for now.
For more, let's now speak to our DW chief international editor, Richard Walker in Washington. Richard, Joe Biden has just issued that statement. How do we read that? Tell us more.
Yeah, Melissa, it's pretty interesting to read. So, I mean, at the top of the statement, Joe Biden makes it pretty clear that, of course, there is no love lost between the United States and Hassan Nasrallah. He says that he and Hezbollah were, I'm quoting here from the statement, so they're responsible for killing hundreds of Americans over a 4-decade reign of terror. He said that his death from that Israeli airstrike is, as he puts it, a measure of justice for his many victims. But if you read the statement as a whole, you see Joe Biden trying to kind of square the circle about these difficulties in the relationship that we've just been hearing about earlier between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government. This sense that they haven't been on the same page. In fact, to some extent, pulling in opposite directions in recent weeks and even in recent months over the whole scope of this conflict. If we look to earlier in the year, the United States in the UN Security Security Council finally put forward a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. That has not yet transpired. During the course of this week, just while the Israelis were preparing for this massive strike on Beirut, the Americans were working with the French to try to bring in a 21-day ceasefire with Hezbollah in the north. So there's this sense that the US and the Israelis have simply not been on the same page. The Americans have been pushing constantly for ceasefires. They've been pushing for de-escalations, whereas the Israelis have been eyeing opportunities to escalate, seizing opportunities may take a strike as dramatic as this. So very much tugging in different directions. Joe Biden now in his statement trying to kind of reconcile these things and say that while he supports the Israelis and that he wants to provide more support towards their defense, that the Americans stand strongly by the Israelis, at the same time as he says it, their ultimate aim is to de-escalate the conflict. So trying to push ahead for diplomatic solutions at this time now.
What is the White House concerned about in terms of the escalation risks? It looks pretty wild already with missiles from the Houthis. It's quite regional already. What is the concern here?
Yeah, so, I mean, there are multiple levels upon which escalation took place. Obviously, I mean, what we are witnessing now with Hezbollah to Israel's north is one form of escalation already. If you look back to the opening of the conflict with the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel last October the 7th. So there's the Hezbollah picture. There's the Houthi picture as well. So, yeah, the Houthis have the potential and have now done this a couple of times to fire missiles into Israel. The Israelis have been able to shoot those down so far, but that is one kind of trajectory for escalation. The Houthis also targeting American warships in the Red Sea. There's also the potential for the Iranians, if they choose to start retaliating themselves, then they can target American forces in Iraq and Syria, and we've seen some of that happening recently as well. That is something very much that the Iranians have done in the past, is targeting American troops. So the Americans very much with their own skin in the game, not just wanting to support the Israelis here. But, you know, these escalation scenarios could go much further than that. There's always been the concern of a direct Iranian-Israeli war. There's been a sort of underlying sense that the Iranians don't want that, but we don't know at what point they may decide, no, we have to go ahead with that. And then there are questions that a lot of analysts are looking at now is how does this extreme weakness now of Hezbollah with its leadership and a lot of its middle leadership also taken out in recent weeks by the Israelis, how does that affect Iranian calculations about its nuclear program, with the Iranians potentially thinking, well, look, our proxy in Hezbollah is much weaker. Now is the time to move towards an Iranian nuclear bomb. So that, of course, could bring its own escalatory dynamics. So an awful lot of potential scenarios that the Americans are thinking about here.
And of course, you talk about that divergence between the communication between Israel and the United States over the last few weeks, the last few months. Is there a limit for Israel beyond which the U.S. will no longer stand behind it?
Well, yeah, so the language that the Biden administration has used throughout this really about its commitment to Israel is that its commitment to Israel is to its security is ironclad. So really emphasizing that the U.S. is firmly committed to Israeli security. But it's kind of interesting to observe that the nature of that commitment is different than, say, America's commitment to NATO allies in Europe. That it's not a formal alliance of the type like NATO with something like an Article 5 guarantee, which of course has come into so much focus during the Ukraine war. The commitment to Israel is really more political, and it's very deep politically. And it is really considered pretty much politically inconceivable for the Americans to essentially abandon the Israelis if they face the prospect of a war with Iran. And I think this is what kind of contributes to the Biden administration's sense that it is unable to restrain the Israelis, because it feels that ultimately it doesn't have a huge amount of leverage over the Netanyahu government, because the Israeli government knows that ultimately the US has to stand by its side.
DW Chief International Editor Richard Walker in Washington. Thank you very much. And Kirstine Rønn is a political scientist who specializes in Lebanon and Iraq and is a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics Middle East Center. Thank you for joining us. This attack on Hezbollah's underground headquarters that killed Nasrallah was the start of an ongoing air campaign that has seen Israel carry out hours of strikes against alleged Hezbollah targets. I wonder, what are the consequences for the residents of the city?
Well, the residents of Beirut and also the residents of South Lebanon are in a very dire situation. Some of these people have been displaced ever since the start of the conflict. We're talking about tens of thousands of people from South Lebanon who were displaced during the initial months. Now we're seeing another wave of displacement from Dahia, Beirut's southern suburbs. And what we're seeing tonight from Beirut are pictures of families sleeping in the streets, staying on blankets. We're seeing children, elderly people preparing for another night in the open. So they are in a very dire situation. And of course, with no pause in the fighting at sight, we can expect these people to become even more desperate in the coming days and weeks and perhaps even months.
With so many people being displaced, where can they go and who's providing them with help?
Well, some of them, the most vulnerable people, have nowhere to go, quite frankly, or will have to find a shelter in some of the schools that the Lebanese government is providing them. We need to remember that this displacement situation has been ongoing in Lebanon for months now, and that has also caused a spike in the rent prices in the safer areas of Lebanon. So it's becoming more and more unaffordable for families to actually rent their own apartments, and this is why we're seeing crowded apartments all across the country, family members moving in to their relatives' places, some people even not being able to move into any friends or relatives' places and have to stay in schools where they sleep on mattresses and have, well, very limited access to privacy and basic facilities.
Israel says it's defending itself against Hezbollah, and the group bears responsibility for what's happening in Beirut and southern Lebanon. I wonder, do people there in Lebanon blame Hezbollah or do they blame Israel?
Well, the most dominant narrative these days is anger against Israel. And we have even heard some of the most fierce critics of Hezbollah saying, now it's not the time to discuss whether or not Hezbollah's weapons are legitimate. Now it's not the time to discuss whether or not Hezbollah has dragged Lebanon into a war. These attacks that have targeted also civilian buildings are seen by most Lebanese, I would say, as disproportionate, as disrespectful to the civilian lives that have been affected. And this is why we're seeing a very widespread anger directed at Israel these days.
And the Lebanese government has had its fair share of domestic problems to deal with. Can it do anything to influence Hezbollah to reach a ceasefire with Israel?
Frankly, it can do very little. The Lebanese government has already welcomed the American-led proposal for a ceasefire or a pause in the fighting. But again, they can't do much to pressure Hezbollah. And Najib Mikati, the caretaker prime minister, already said that actually back in October last year. He said the decision whether or not to go to war with Israel was out of his hands. So we can't really trust that the Lebanese government can put much pressure on Hezbollah. And we also need to bear in mind that on the other side of the front line, Israel has also rejected proposals for a ceasefire. So they're also standing in the way of a pause in the fighting as it is now.
And then, of course, that leads to the question of whether there's a risk of a return to civil war in Lebanon if Hezbollah, as it has threatened to do, continues hostilities against Israel and Lebanon as a whole is engulfed in this.
Well, this is a question that's being raised these days, but it is important to say that Lebanon has now experienced an unseen level of unity. Even Saad Hariri, whose father, Rafiq al-Hariri, was killed allegedly by Hezbollah, has been out condemning Israel's attacks. So we are seeing a high level of unity, people helping each other across sectarian lines. That being said, we've also seen reports of the Lebanese armed forces, so Lebanon's official army, deploying soldiers and tanks at sensitive spots in Beirut, at intersections, for instance, between neighborhoods that host supporters of Hezbollah and opponents of Hezbollah. And that, of course, is due to a fear that some of these groups, some individuals might clash, especially after the news of Hassan Nasrallah's death.
And Kirstine Rønn, thank you so much for joining us.